Sit down. Sit down. Let me pour you something and let me tell you about a man they don't want you to know too much about. Because if you know too much about him, you start asking too many questions about everything else they told you in that Sunday school flannel board story. We talking about Methuselah. Yeah, I said it. Methuselah, the man who lived 969 years. Not a typo, not a translation error, not some ancient exaggeration like your uncle telling you about the fish he caught. 969 years on this earth, breathing, walking, eating, probably had knee problems by year 800, but still out here existing longer than entire empires, longer than Rome lasted from rise to fall, longer than most nations you can name today have even existed as a concept. And here's the thing they don't tell you in that watered-down vacation Bible school version of the story. This man was African. Let that sit in your chest for a second before you get defensive about it. He was African, not Middle Eastern the way they redraw the map every time it's convenient. Not some pale illustration from a children's picture Bible with a man who looks like he just left a Renaissance painting in Florence. African, from the land, of the land, connected to rivers that the Bible itself names as being in Cush. And Cush, if your history teacher ever told you the truth, is Ethiopia, is Africa, is black land, black soil, black people. Thousands of years before anybody in Europe even had running water indoors. Now look, I'm not here to just hype you up with no receipts. Your uncle at the cookout who just talks loud with no proof, that's not me. I brought the paperwork. I brought the genealogy. I brought the geography. I brought the Hebrew. Sit still, because we finna go somewhere, and by the time we done, you gonna look at that Bible on your grandmama's shelf completely different. You gonna pick it up and read Genesis chapter 5 like it's a court document. Because that's what it is. It's a record. It's a family tree. It's a chain of custody for the human race, and Methuselah sitting right there in the middle of it, holding down the record like Wilt Chamberlain, holding down a stat sheet nobody gonna ever break. Let's start with who this man even is, because half of y'all heard the name in a rap song or heard your pastor mention it in a sermon about long life, and that's it. That's the extent of the knowledge. Methuselah is the son of Enoch. Now Enoch, we're going to talk about Enoch a whole lot too, because Enoch is one of only two men in the entire Bible who ain't never died. Read that again. Enoch walked with God, and he was not, for God took him. Man ain't die. He got translated, taken up, whatever you want to call it, but there's no funeral for Enoch, no grave. No, and he died like every other name in that chapter. Every other cat in Genesis 5, the Bible got this rhythm going, and he lived, and he had sons and daughters, and all the days that he lived were such and such years, and he died. Boom, next name, same pattern, like a genealogy record read by a court clerk with no emotion. Adam, lived, died. Seth, lived, died. Enosh, lived, died. Kenan, lived, died. Mahalalel, lived, died. Jared, lived, died. Then Enoch comes in and breaks the whole pattern. The record scratches because Enoch didn't die. And whose daddy was Enoch? Methuselah's daddy. So right out the gate, before we even get to the number 969, you need to understand Methuselah was raised by a man who walked so close with God that God just took him home early. Didn't even let him go through the dying process like everybody else. That's the household Methuselah grew up in. That's the blueprint he was raised on. Now here's something that should stop you in your tracks if you actually sit with the math. And I want you to really sit with this, because the Bible be dropping clues like a detective show, and everybody just skip past it because they reading fast trying to get to Noah and the ark. Methuselah's name, and this is where the Hebrew comes in, so pay attention. His name is widely understood to mean when he dies, it shall be sent, or his death shall bring. Some scholars break it down as man of the dart or man of the javelin, tied to sending something forth. But the interpretation that rocked theologians for centuries is this: Methuselah's very name was prophetic. His name was a countdown clock. Some folks calculated, and you can check this against Genesis 5 and Genesis 7 yourself. Get your calculator out, I ain't playing. That the year Methuselah died is the exact same year the flood came. Same year. You mean to tell me God named this brother when he dies, judgment comes, and then let him live longer than any human being in recorded history before finally calling him home the same year he flooded the entire earth? That ain't coincidence, family. That's mercy. That's God stretching out judgment, holding back the water, because Methuselah was still breathing. This man's life was literally the delay of the apocalypse. While Methuselah walked this earth, the flood waited. You want to talk about pressure? Imagine being the reason destruction gets postponed just by you drawing breath. That's a heavier crown than any king ever wore. Now let's deal with the number itself, because I already told you, 969 years. People in the barbershop always want to argue, man, that's symbolic, that's not literal. Back then a year meant something different, maybe it was months. Nah, stop it. Stop trying to shrink the man down to fit your comfort zone. The genealogies in Genesis are painfully specific. They tell you how old the man was when he had his son, and then how many years he lived after that. And then they add it up for you. Methuselah lived 187 years, had Lamech. Then he lived 782 more years after that, had other sons and daughters. Add it up, 187 plus 782, that's 969. The Bible do the math for you like a receipt at the end of a Popeyes order. It's not vague. It's not he lived a long time, the end. It is precise, generational, dated record keeping, the same way your grandmama keep the family Bible with everybody's birthdays written in the front pages in that fading ink. This is ancient record keeping, and it's meticulous. And I need you to understand something about ancient record keeping in general before we go further. Because see, this is where the miseducation really shows up. They want you to think black folks, African folks, ancient African civilizations didn't keep records, didn't have systems, didn't track genealogy, didn't have astronomy or mathematics sophisticated enough to track years across centuries. Meanwhile, you got the Dogon people in Mali who had accurate knowledge of Sirius B, a star you can't even see with the naked eye, knowledge that European astronomers didn't confirm until they had telescopes in the 1970s. You got Egyptians, and let's be real, Egypt is Africa, Egypt is in Africa. Don't let nobody tell you Egypt floating out somewhere in the Mediterranean disconnected from the continent it's physically attached to. Building pyramids with mathematical precision that still confuses engineers today. So don't sit here and act like a genealogy tracking 900 years across a lineage is somehow beyond ancient capability. These people had calendars. These people tracked lunar cycles, agricultural seasons, flood cycles of rivers like the Nile, which by the way is connected to this whole story too. Because we finna talk about rivers in a minute, and you gonna see exactly why that matters. Let's go to the geography, because this is where I really need you to lean in. Because this is the part they skip over in Sunday school faster than they skip over Noah getting drunk naked in his tent after the flood. Yeah, that's in there too, but that's another sermon for another day. Genesis chapter 2 describes the Garden of Eden, the origin point, the birthplace of humanity according to the biblical text, and it names 4 rivers that flow out from Eden: Pishon, Gihon, Hiddekel, which is the Tigris, and Euphrates. Now the Tigris and Euphrates, everybody quick to point to Iraq, Mesopotamia, and fine, that tracks, that region is real, that history is real. But look what the text says about the second river, the Gihon. Genesis 2 verse 13, it says the name of the second river is Gihon, the same river that goes around the whole land of Cush. Cush, not Assyria, not some region they trying to rename to disconnect it from Africa. Cush, and every single serious biblical scholar, every Hebrew lexicon, every ancient historian, including the Jewish historian Josephus, identifies Cush as the land inhabited by the descendants of Ham's son Cush, and that land is Ethiopia, ancient Nubia. Ancient Cush, the Cushite kingdom, which archaeology confirms sat south of Egypt in what's now Sudan and Ethiopia. Black land, black kingdom. A civilization so advanced they had their own pyramids, and there's more pyramids in Sudan than there are in Egypt. Let that marinate. Their own written language, Meroitic script that scholars still working to fully decode today. So think about what I just told you. The Bible's own geography places one of the 4 rivers of Eden, the birthplace of humanity, the starting point of the entire human genealogy that leads directly to Methuselah, flowing around Cush, around Ethiopia, around black African land. This ain't me making up connections out of thin air trying to force a narrative. This is the text. This is Genesis 2, verse 13. Sitting right there in whatever Bible translation you got on your shelf right now. King James, Niv, doesn't matter, go check it, I'll wait. The geography of humanity's origin point, according to scripture itself, is tied directly to Africa. And Methuselah descends directly from that origin point through an unbroken lineage, Adam to Seth, to Enosh, to Kenan, to Mahalalel, to Jared, to Enoch, to Methuselah. Every single one of these men living in that region, in that world, in that geography that the text itself anchors to Cush. Now, some of y'all gonna say, okay, uncle, but that's just about where Eden was. That don't automatically make Methuselah black. And I hear you, that's a fair pushback, so let's keep building because I ain't done, I'm just getting warm. We gotta talk about Ham. We gotta talk about Noah's sons, because Methuselah's great-grandson, through Lamech, is Noah. Yeah, that's right, Methuselah is Noah's grandfather. Methuselah is the grandfather of the man who survived the flood, the man from whom every single human being alive today descends, according to the biblical narrative. So this bloodline, this family, is the family. It's not a side character family, it's the family. The last family standing after the flood wipes out everybody else. And Noah's sons, Shem, Ham, and Japheth, become, according to the very same text, the fathers of all the nations that repopulate the earth after the flood. Ham's descendants are explicitly named as populating Africa: Cush, Mizraim, which is Egypt, Put, which is Libya, Canaan. This is Genesis chapter 10, the Table of Nations. One of the most historically and geographically consistent chapters in the entire ancient world, so consistent that historians and cartographers still reference it when studying ancient ethnic and geographic distribution. Ham is the African line, and guess what? Ham's daddy is Noah, and Noah's granddaddy is Methuselah. You following the thread? This ain't a coincidence stacked on a coincidence. This is a direct, documented, textual bloodline that flows straight out of the same geography, Cush, Ethiopia, the Gihon River region, into the man who becomes the father of the African nations after the flood. Methuselah sits at the root of that tree, not a branch, the root. And let's pause right here, because I want to address the elephant in the room, the thing everybody's uncle at the cookout eventually brings up when this conversation starts. Well, why do all the pictures show these Bible characters as white men with flowing hair like they walked off a shampoo commercial? Great question. Terrible answer coming your way, because the answer is art history, colonization, and convenience. European Renaissance painters in the 14 and 1500s, Michelangelo, Da Vinci, all of them, they painted biblical figures to look like the people around them, in their own European context, for their own European audiences, in their own European churches. That's not historical accuracy, that's cultural projection. That's like if I drew Julius Caesar looking like my cousin Ray Ray from around the corner because that's who was around when I picked up the paintbrush. Then, this imagery gets mass-produced, gets shipped around the world through colonization and missionary work, gets stuck into every children's Bible, every stained glass window. every Sunday school poster, until generations of people, including black children in black churches, grow up looking at a blonde-haired, blue-eyed Jesus and a rosy-cheeked pink Methuselah and think that's just how it was. That's not history. That's marketing. That's branding. And it's been so effective that when somebody comes along, like me, right now, pouring you a drink and telling you the geography and the genealogy straight from the actual text, you almost don't believe it because the image has been hammered into your head harder than the actual book has. So let's keep stacking receipts because I told you I don't come empty-handed. Let's talk about Josephus for a second because Josephus is a first-century Jewish historian. Wrote extensively about biblical history, and he's considered one of the most credible ancient sources cross-referencing biblical genealogy with real historical geography. Josephus confirms the identification of Cush with Ethiopia repeatedly throughout his work Antiquities of the Jews. He's not alone. This identification of Cush as Ethiopia, as black African land south of Egypt, is affirmed across Jewish, Christian, and even Islamic historical traditions for centuries before European colonial mapmakers started getting cute with renaming and repositioning things to distance biblical history from Africa. This is not a fringe Afrocentric theory cooked up in the last 50 years to make black folks feel good. This is old, established, cross-referenced historical and theological consensus that only got muddied once it became politically and socially inconvenient during the transatlantic slave trade era to admit that the foundational family of the entire Bible, the family God chose to preserve through the flood, the family that repopulates the earth, has direct, explicit, textual roots in black African geography and black African descendants. Now let's bring it back to Methuselah specifically, because I don't want you to lose him in all this genealogy, because this whole thing is about him, the man himself, 969 years walking this earth. Think about what he witnessed. Think about the sheer scope of history packed into one man's lifetime. He's born, according to the genealogical count, a little over 200 years after Adam, meaning it's entirely possible, some scholars argue very likely, that Methuselah and Adam's life overlapped. You understand what I'm saying? Methuselah could have looked into the eyes of the first man God ever formed from dust. He could have sat at the feet of Adam, heard directly, firsthand, unfiltered, uncorrupted by generations of retelling, what it was like to walk in the actual Garden of Eden before the fall. No telephone game, no exaggeration passed down through 6 generations, straight from the source. Adam could have told Methuselah personally what God's voice sounded like walking in the cool of the day. That's not a bedtime story anymore when you realize the timeline actually allows for that overlap. That's a direct witness account passed to a man who then lived long enough to become his own great-grandson's grandfather, while that great-grandson built a boat the size of a modern cargo ship to survive a global flood. And that's the other piece. Methuselah died the same year, by most calculations, that the flood came. So this man watched, or at minimum, heard, participated in, and possibly helped fund, build, or organize the construction of an ark that had to be massive enough to house 2 of every kind of animal on planet Earth, plus food supplies, plus his own family. You think that's a small project? You think Noah just woke up one random Tuesday and knocked that out over a weekend with a handsaw? No, that's decades of construction. According to most traditional readings, 100 years is the commonly cited figure for how long Noah spent building that ark while preaching righteousness to a world that laughed at him the entire time. And Methuselah, his grandfather, living right there, in that same world, watching his grandson get mocked, ridiculed, called crazy, called a fool for building a boat on dry land for a rain that ain't never fallen before because it suggested there wasn't even rainfall in that pre-flood world in the way we understand it now. Some scholars point to a mist watering the earth mentioned back in Genesis 2. So imagine the audacity it took for Noah to build something for a phenomenon that had literally never occurred. And Methuselah watched that whole thing unfold, generation after generation, mockery after mockery, and then died, right on time, right at the appointed hour, before the flood came and swept away everybody who wasn't in that boat. You see how deep this goes now? You see why I said sit down and pour something, because we ain't even scratched the surface yet. We got so much more ground to cover. We got to talk about what 969 years actually reveals about pre-flood biology and environment. We got to talk about other ancient civilizations, including African civilizations that recorded similarly extended lifespans in their own king lists. We got to talk about the Sumerian king list that lists rulers reigning for tens of thousands of years. We got to talk about what changed after the flood that caused human lifespan to crash down to the hundreds and then eventually to the 70 years that we consider normal today. We got to talk about Enoch's book, the Book of Enoch, which ain't in your standard Protestant Bible, but is absolutely central to Ethiopian Orthodox Christianity, canonized, considered scripture in Ethiopia, Black Ethiopia, while European churches tossed it out. We got to talk about why that matters, why an African church preserved a book about Methuselah's father that European churches rejected. That's not random. That's a whole other layer of receipts. But I wanted you to sit with this first part, let it breathe, let it settle in your chest like good greens on Sunday before we go further. Methuselah is real, according to the text. Methuselah's record, 969 years, is documented with mathematical precision in Genesis 5. Methuselah's lineage traces directly through a geography the Bible itself names as Cush, as Ethiopia, as Black African land. Methuselah's grandson Noah becomes father to Ham, whose descendants populate Africa according to Genesis 10. And Methuselah's very name carries a prophetic weight tied to the timing of the flood itself. This is not speculation dressed up as fact. This is the text, read plainly, cross-referenced with geography that hasn't changed, regardless of how many times map makers try to redraw the emotional and cultural distance between the Bible and the African continent it's rooted in. We got more to uncover, family. Stay right there. Don't get up yet. We just getting to the good part. All right, sit back down, because I see you inching to the edge of your seat, and that's exactly where I want you, because now we're getting into the part that really messes with the foundation of what you thought you knew about the ancient world, the part about biology, environment, and why a man living 969 years ain't even the strangest thing going on in that pre-flood world. Because see, everybody wants to isolate Methuselah like he's some anomaly, some glitch in the system, one weird outlier that can just wave away. But he ain't alone. He's part of a pattern. Look at the whole line again. Adam lived 930 years. Seth, 912. Enosh, 905. Kenan, 910. Mahalalel, 895. Jared, 962. Enoch, he only did 365 before God took him, but that's because his walk was cut short on purpose, not because the ceiling wasn't there. Methuselah, 969, the record holder. Lamech, 777. Then Noah, 950. You see what's happening? Every single man in this lineage is living somewhere between 8 and 9 and even approaching 1,000 years, consistently, generation after generation, like it's just normal, like it ain't nothing, like that's just how long a man's supposed to live. That's not one freak occurrence. That's an entire era operating under different rules than the ones we live under now. And that should make you ask the obvious question, what changed? What happened to the human body? To the earth itself, that took lifespans from 900 plus years crashing down to what we got now. And this is where I need you to pull your chair a little closer, because we finna talk science mixed with scripture, and I promise you it's gonna blow your wig back. Genesis chapter 1 talks about a firmament, waters above and waters below. Some scholars, some scientists who take the text seriously have proposed what's called a vapor canopy theory, the idea that before the flood, the earth was surrounded by a thick layer of water vapor in the upper atmosphere, creating a kind of greenhouse effect, a shield. Now think about what a shield like that would do. It will filter out harmful cosmic radiation, the same radiation that scientists today confirm damages DNA, breaks down cellular structure, ages the human body, causes mutation over time. It would also regulate the climate globally, creating a stable, mild environment everywhere. No violent weather extremes, no direct harsh sun beating down unfiltered. Higher atmospheric pressure under that canopy could have meant higher oxygen concentration, and higher oxygen concentration has actually been shown in modern hyperbaric research to promote accelerated healing and potentially slow cellular aging. So when the flood comes and that canopy, whatever it was, water vapor, ice shell, whatever theory you want to run with, collapses and falls as the rain that floods the earth for 40 days and 40 nights, that protective shield is gone forever. And what happens right after the flood in the genealogical record? Watch the numbers crash. Shem, Noah's son, lived 600 years, already dropping. Arphaxad, 438. Salah, 433. Eber, 464. Peleg, 239. Reu, 239. Serug, 230. Nahor, only 148. Terah, 205. And then you get to Abraham, the father of nations, the man God made covenant with, and Abraham only lives to 175. By the time you get to Moses, the number they consider a full blessed life is 120 years. And Moses himself says in Psalm 90, written by him, that the days of our years are 70, 70 years. And if by reason of strength they be 80, yet is their strength labor and sorrow. You see that decline? That's not random. That's a documented textual generational crash from 900 plus years down to 70 to 80 years, happening in direct correlation with a global catastrophic event that fundamentally altered the Earth's atmosphere and environment. That's not fantasy. That's the text tracking an environmental collapse with the same precision it tracked Methuselah's birth of his son. Now here's why I bring up the Sumerian king list, because I told you I wasn't going to leave you hanging on that. See, skeptics love to say the Bible's ages are just mythological exaggeration, ancient people just like big numbers, don't mean nothing. But then you got to explain to me why an entirely separate civilization, Sumer, over in ancient Mesopotamia, kept their own king list. A real archaeological artifact, the Sumerian king lists, inscribed on actual clay prisms and tablets you can go see in museums right now, and that list records ancient kings before a great flood reigning for periods like 18,000 years, 28,000 years, 43,200 years for one king named Enmenluana. Now look, I ain't saying those numbers are literal in the same way. Some scholars think Sumerian numbering systems use different base counting that inflates things, base 60 instead of base 10. And there's debate about how to translate ancient numeric systems properly. But strip away the specific digits for a second and look at the pattern, an entirely separate, independent ancient civilization with no direct connection to the Hebrew scribes writing Genesis, also preserved the cultural memory of ancient rulers living extraordinarily long lives before a catastrophic flood, and then normal length reigns after the flood. Same pattern, same structural memory, long life before the flood, dramatic reduction after. You've got the Sumerian historian priest Berossus, writing in Greek in the 3rd century before Christ, also recording 10 antediluvian kings with massive reigns before a great deluge, 10 kings before the flood in the Sumerian tradition, 10 generations before the flood in the Genesis tradition from Adam to Noah. That's not coincidence stacking on coincidence no more, family. That's cross-cultural historical memory of the same real event, told from different cultural lenses with different numeric systems, but the same essential structure. Extended pre-flood lifespans and a flood that changes everything. And I want you to sit with something else, because this is where it gets even more interesting when you bring Africa back into the center of this conversation instead of letting it stay on the margins where the textbooks want to keep it. Egyptian civilization, which again is African civilization, don't let nobody tell you different. Egyptian king lists, particularly the Turin king list and information preserved through the priest Manetho, also reference dynasties of gods and demigods ruling for extraordinarily long periods before the more historically documented dynasties began. You've got ancient African oral traditions across the continent, from West African griot traditions that memorize genealogies stretching back dozens of generations with word-for-word precision passed down through professional oral historians, to Ethiopian royal chronicles that trace lineage all the way back to Solomon and Sheba with documented specificity. Ancient African peoples have always had sophisticated systems for tracking long lineages, long time spans, generational memory. This is not a culture incapable of tracking a man living 969 years. This is a culture, an entire continent of cultures, built on the exact kind of meticulous record-keeping that the Genesis genealogies represent. So when European Enlightenment thinkers and later colonial anthropologists tried to paint Africa as some ahistorical continent, a place with no writing, no records, no sense of time or history before European contact, that's not just wrong. That's a strategic erasure, because acknowledging African record-keeping sophistication undermines the entire justification structure built to validate colonization and slavery. If Africa had complex civilizations, written language, astronomical knowledge, genealogical precision, then the whole civilizing mission live falls apart. So they had to convince the world and convince black folks themselves that none of that history existed, that none of that memory was real, that Africa was a blank slate before Europe showed up. And that same erasure machine is exactly what's been applied to the Bible's African roots. Same machine, same motive, different target. Now let's talk about the Book of Enoch, because I promised you and I don't break promises, especially not about something this important. The Book of Enoch is one of the most fascinating pieces of ancient literature connected to this entire bloodline, because remember, Enoch is Methuselah's father. And the Book of Enoch, sometimes called First Enoch to distinguish it from other Enochic texts, is an ancient Jewish religious work dated by scholars to somewhere around the 3rd or 2nd century before Christ for its earliest sections, though some material may reflect even older oral traditions. It expands massively on that one cryptic line in Genesis about the sons of God seeing the daughters of men were fair, and giants being in the earth in those days, the Nephilim. The Book of Enoch goes deep into this, describing fallen angels called Watchers, describing their corruption of humanity, describing Enoch's visions of heaven, judgment, and cosmic order. Now here's the kicker. This book is quoted directly in the New Testament. The book of Jude, verse 14 and 15, directly quotes Enoch prophesying about the Lord coming with 10,000 of his saints to execute judgment. That's a direct citation of a book most Western Christians have never even heard of, sitting right there in the New Testament that they read every Sunday. So the question becomes, if this book was important enough for the writer of Jude to quote it as authoritative, why did it get stripped out of most Bibles? And here's where the story gets real interesting, because it wasn't stripped out everywhere. The Ethiopian Orthodox Tewahedo Church, a black African Christian church, one of the oldest Christian institutions on planet Earth, older than most European Christian denominations, tracing its roots back to the 4th century and claiming even older connections through the Ethiopian eunuch mentioned in Acts chapter 8, The Ethiopian Orthodox Church kept the Book of Enoch in their biblical canon. It's scripture to them, full stop. Not apocrypha, not a curiosity, not a footnote, canonized scripture, read, taught, preserved. Copied by hand, generation after generation by Ethiopian scribes for over 1,000 years while European churches debated, argued, and eventually excluded it from their canons during councils that most Christians today couldn't even name. In fact, for a long time, the only complete surviving copies of the Book of Enoch that scholars had access to were preserved in Ge'ez, the ancient liturgical language of Ethiopia. Ge'ez, not Latin, not Greek. Ge'ez, an African language preserved by African Christians, kept alive in African monasteries, while the rest of the so-called civilized Christian world lost the text entirely for centuries until fragments started resurfacing in the 1700s when European explorer James Bruce brought copies back from Ethiopia. Let that marinate. A foundational piece of ancient Jewish and early Christian literature connected directly to Methuselah's own father survived because of Black African religious devotion and scholarship, while European Christianity let it slip through its fingers and forgot it existed. That's not a small detail. That's a massive clue about who was actually guarding the deepest layers of this history the whole time. And think about the theological implications of that for a second, because this ties back into everything we already covered. If Ethiopian Christians, Black African Christians, were the ones preserving the deepest, most mystical, most cosmically significant texts connected to Enoch, the father of Methuselah, doesn't that tell you something about the ancestral memory at play here? It's like the culture itself remembered something the rest of the world tried to forget. It's like the descendants of Cush held on to the family Bible, the real one, the deep one, while everybody else got a censored, redacted, Europeanized summary and started believing that summary was the whole story. That's generational preservation. That's spiritual custodianship. And it lines up perfectly with everything we already established about the Gihon River flowing around Cush, about Ham's descendants populating Africa, about the entire genealogical structure rooting itself in African geography from the very beginning of Genesis. Now let me bring this back down to street level for a second, because I don't want you to get lost in all this historical density without feeling the weight of what it means for you. Right now, today, for generations, Black children grew up in churches, beautiful churches, faithful churches, churches with the best choirs on God's green earth, looking up at images of white Jesus, white Methuselah, white Noah, white Adam, and being taught implicitly, if not explicitly, that holiness looks a certain way, that the favored family of God, the family chosen to survive the flood, the family through which the entire human race gets a second chance, look like the people who colonized, enslaved, and oppressed their actual ancestors. You understand the psychological warfare embedded in that? You grow up thinking the heroes of your own faith don't look like you, don't come from where you come from, and meanwhile the actual text, if you sit down and read it slowly, plainly, without the stained glass filter, tells you a completely different story. Tells you that the origin point of humanity is geographically tied to Cush. Tells you that the man who survived the flood has a son whose descendants populate Africa. Tells you that the oldest man who ever lived is sitting directly in that bloodline, connected to that geography, connected to that African identity, and that the very people who preserve some of the deepest, most mystical layers of that story, the Ethiopian church, are Black African Christians who never stopped believing it, never stopped copying it, never stopped teaching it to their children while the rest of the world went and drew a different picture entirely. This is why representation in sacred history ain't just about feelings, ain't just about some surface level everybody wants to see themselves argument, though that matters too, don't get me wrong. This is about historical accuracy. This is about textual integrity. This is about actually reading Genesis 5 and Genesis 2 and Genesis 10 and Genesis 17 back to back and letting the geography and genealogy speak for itself instead of overlaying centuries of European colonial art and colonial theology on top of it, like a filter you forgot was even there. Because once you take the filter off, Methuselah stops being some random old white man in a picture book and starts being exactly what the text describes: a direct descendant of a lineage rooted in Cush, grandfather to Noah, patriarch of the family from which Ham's African nations directly descend, holder of the longevity record in an era where the entire earth operated under different environmental conditions, living long enough to have possibly met Adam himself and long enough to watch his own grandson build a boat that would carry humanity through the greatest catastrophe in recorded history. Now some of y'all still sitting there in the back with your arms crossed saying, "Okay, uncle, but ain't the whole Earth's population from Noah's sons anyway? Ain't everybody mixed up together after the flood? Ain't we all one people at the end of the day?" And yeah, theologically, yes, absolutely. The Bible teaches all humanity descends from Noah's 3 sons. We are one blood. Acts 17:26, God made of one blood all nations of men. I'm not here to tell you this is some exclusionary claim like only black people matter in this story. That's not the point. And don't let nobody twist what I'm saying into that. The point is corrective, not exclusionary. The point is, for centuries, the narrative got twisted to erase, minimize, and whitewash the African contribution and African identity within this shared sacred history, while simultaneously using twisted, out-of-context readings of the Curse of Ham, which we need to talk about too, because that lie did catastrophic damage to justify centuries of slavery and oppression against the very descendants of the man who, according to the text itself, comes directly out of this holy, honored, patriarchal bloodline. The same bloodline they used to justify enslaving black people is the same bloodline that produces Methuselah, produces Cush, produces the African nations named with dignity and specificity in Genesis 10. That's the hypocrisy. That's the contradiction sitting at the heart of centuries of theological malpractice, and it's time somebody laid it out plainly at the table with the paperwork, the same way I'm laying it out for you right now. And that Curse of Ham lie, let's sit with it for 1 second before we move forward, because it's too important to just mention in passing and keep moving. Genesis 9. After the flood, Noah gets drunk off wine from his own vineyard, ends up naked in his tent, and his son Ham sees his father's nakedness and tells his brothers Shem and Japheth, who then walk in backwards with a garment to cover their father without looking at him. When Noah wakes up and finds out what happened, he curses, and read this carefully, he curses Canaan. Not Ham. Canaan, Ham's son specifically, gets cursed to be a servant of servants to his brothers. Now for centuries, slaveholders, colonial theologians, and pro-slavery preachers twisted this text, deliberately misapplied it to Ham broadly, and then further twisted it to apply specifically to black Africans as a race, claiming this curse justified enslaving an entire race of people for perpetuity. This is one of the most catastrophic misreadings in the history of biblical interpretation, and it was done on purpose, weaponized on purpose, by people who needed theological cover for an economic system built on stolen labor and stolen bodies. The text says Canaan. Canaan's descendants settle in the land of Canaan, modern-day Israel and Palestine region, not sub-Saharan Africa broadly. Cush, Mizraim, and Put, Ham's other sons, the ones actually associated with African territories, are never cursed in this passage at all. Never. The curse is specific, textual, geographically located, and it is not Cush. It is not Ethiopia. It is Canaan. This distinction was known, available, readable by anyone with an open Bible and functioning eyesight, and yet an entire economic and social system chose to ignore that distinction because the lie was more profitable than the truth. That's not ancient history either. That lie was being preached from American pulpits well into the 19th century, used to keep enslaved people compliant, used to convince some enslaved people themselves that their bondage was divinely ordained, which is one of the cruelest forms of psychological violence you can inflict on a human being, using their own sacred text twisted against them, to convince them God wanted them in chains. So when we reclaim Methuselah, when we reclaim his African roots, his connection to Cush, his position in a bloodline that the text itself honors and elevates rather than curses, we're not just doing some feel-good genealogy exercise. We're doing corrective surgery on centuries of theological malpractice. We're taking the same book that got weaponized against our ancestors and reading it the way it was actually written, the way the original audience would have understood it, geographically, culturally, linguistically, and showing that the actual text never supported the lie that got built on top of it. Methuselah stands as living proof, 969 years of proof that this bloodline, this African-rooted bloodline, was not cursed, was not lesser, was not marked for servitude, but was instead marked for extraordinary longevity, extraordinary honor, sitting at the very root of the tree that produces righteous Noah, the man God chose out of the entire corrupted earth to start humanity over again. We still got more ground to cover, family. We need to talk about what happened to this record after the flood, why other cultures independently preserve memory of long-lived patriarchs, what modern genetics and epigenetics are starting to suggest about longevity and environmental factors that might actually support parts of this ancient record instead of dismissing it outright. And we need to close this whole thing out by talking about what Methuselah's life actually means for how we should be living ours. What lessons a man who watched roughly 10 generations pass through his household could possibly teach a generation of people who can't sit through a red light without checking their phone. So don't get up. Let me pour you a little more. We ain't done yet. All right, top it off one more time, because now we in the home stretch, and the home stretch is always where the real teaching happens. That's just how it go, whether it's a sermon, a cookout story, or a barbershop debate that started at noon and still going strong at 6. We done covered the genealogy. We done covered the geography. We done covered the Hebrew. We done covered the atmosphere theory. We done covered Sumer and Egypt and Ethiopia and the Book of Enoch and the Curse of Ham lie that got twisted into chains. Now I want to bring this thing all the way home, because knowledge without application is just trivia, and I ain't drove all this way, poured all these drinks to leave you with trivia. I want to leave you with wisdom. I want to leave you with something you carry out that door and into your actual life, because that's what this whole family tree been trying to teach us the whole time if we just slow down long enough to listen. Let's talk about genetics for a second, because I told you we would, and I keep my word. Now modern science, real peer-reviewed, published, respected science, has been chasing the question of human longevity for decades, and what they finding is fascinating when you hold it up next to this ancient record instead of dismissing the ancient record on sight. Researchers studying telomeres, those little protective caps on the end of your DNA strands, kind of like the plastic tip on the end of a shoelace that keeps it from fraying, have found that telomere length and telomere degradation is directly connected to aging and lifespan. Every time a cell divides, those telomeres shorten a little bit, and once they get too short, the cell can't divide properly anymore, and that's part of what drives the aging process in the human body. Now here's where it gets interesting. Scientists have identified that environmental stressors, oxidative stress, radiation exposure, diet, and even psychological stress all accelerate telomere shortening. You strip away environmental stressors, you reduce oxidative damage, you create an ideal environment with filtered radiation and stable climate and higher oxygen availability. which is exactly what that pre-flood vapor canopy theory proposes. And you got a biological mechanism that could plausibly support radically extended lifespans without breaking a single law of biology as we understand it. I ain't saying science proved Methuselah lived 969 years. I'm saying science stopped laughing at the possibility the more they learned about what actually drives aging on the cellular level. There's research out of places like the Okinawa longevity studies in Japan. There's research into caloric restriction extending lifespan in laboratory animals by significant margins. There's research into naked mole rats of all creatures who barely age at all compared to their body size and live decades longer than similarly sized rodents because of unique cellular repair mechanisms. The point is, biology is not nearly as fixed and rigid as your ninth grade textbook made it seem. Lifespan is elastic. Lifespan responds to environment. And once you accept that basic scientific principle, the pre-flood world described in Genesis, different atmosphere, different radiation exposure, different oxygen levels, different diet, no meat consumption until after the flood, by the way. Check Genesis 9. God explicitly grants meat eating to Noah after the flood in a way that implies it wasn't the standard before. All of that stacks up into a coherent picture of a world operating under different biological rules, not magic, not fairy tale, different environmental inputs producing different biological outputs. That's science. That's just science applied to an ancient text instead of dismissing the ancient text before doing the science. And I want you to sit with the epigenetics piece too, because this is even more recent research, still developing, but already reshaping how we think about inheritance. Epigenetics is teaching us that trauma, environment, diet, stress, these things don't just affect you. They can actually change how your genes express themselves. And that altered expression can get passed down to your children and even your grandchildren without changing the actual DNA sequence itself. Scientists have studied this in populations who survived famine, populations who survived generational trauma, and found measurable epigenetic markers passed down through descendants who never personally experienced the original event. Now think about what that means applied backward through this genealogy. If environment shapes genetic expression and genetic expression shapes lifespan, health, resilience, then a family lineage rooted in a stable, protected pre-flood environment for generation after generation could absolutely be carrying compounding biological advantages that we, living in our stressed out, radiation exposed, processed food eating, sleep-deprived modern world can barely even imagine. Methuselah wasn't just old because he got lucky. Methuselah was old because he was the product of 9 generations of humans living in an environment engineered, according to the text, by God himself to sustain human life at a length we now consider mythological. That's not a fluke. That's design. Now let's pull back out to the bigger picture again, because I want to talk about what happens to a people when their history gets stolen piece by piece. Because that's really what we've been unpacking this whole time, whether we've been talking about Methuselah's skin, or Cush's rivers, or Ham's sons, or Ethiopia's preserved scripture. This whole documentary, if you want to call it that, this whole sit-down conversation is really about theft. Not theft of gold, not theft of land, though that happened too, obviously, that's a whole other conversation. This is about theft of narrative. Somebody took the pen out of our hand and started writing our own sacred history for us. And when they wrote it, they wrote themselves into the starring role and wrote us into the background, into the cursed roles, into the servant roles, into the not mentioned roles, when the actual original text, in the actual original language, in the actual original geography, tells a completely different story. And once a people lose control of their own narrative, once they let somebody else hold the pen on their history, their theology, their identity, it becomes incredibly easy to convince that people that they were never meant for greatness, never meant for honor, never meant to be central to anything important, that they were always meant to be on the margins, always meant to serve, always meant to be an afterthought in somebody else's story. That's the real damage, not just historical inaccuracy for its own sake, but the psychological residue it leaves on generations of people who internalize the lie and pass it down without even realizing they're passing down a lie. So when we reclaim Methuselah, and reclaim is the right word, because this ain't invention, this ain't making something up that wasn't there, this is going back and finding what was always there and just got buried under paint and propaganda. When we reclaim him, we reclaiming the idea that blackness was present, honored, and central at the very root of the human story, according to the same book that got used against us. We reclaiming the idea that the oldest man who ever lived, the man whose very name carried prophetic weight about the timing of judgment itself, whose life quite literally held back the flood, was rooted in African geography, African lineage, African identity, long before Europe even had a name for itself as a continent. That matters. That matters for the kid growing up in a church that never showed him a single image of holiness that looked like his own grandmother. That matters for the young sister who'd been told her whole life that her ancestors only show up in the Bible as cursed servants, when actually her ancestors show up as the root of the family tree God chose to save from the flood. That matters for the historian, the theologian, the pastor, the professor, anybody willing to actually crack open Genesis and read it slow, instead of reading it through 500 years of European religious art hanging over their shoulder like a filter they forgot was even there. Now let me talk to you about lessons, because I promised you lessons, and I ain't gonna leave you with just facts and no application, because facts without application is just a museum tour, and I told you at the very beginning, this ain't a museum voice. This is a cookout voice. This is a barbershop voice. This is a big brother voice. And big brothers don't just drop knowledge and walk away. Big brothers make sure you know what to do with it. Lesson number 1, patience and longevity are connected to purpose. Methuselah didn't just happen to live 969 years for no reason. His life was tied to timing, tied to mercy, tied to holding back judgment for as long as possible. That teaches you something about your own life, family, your days. However many you get, they connected to purpose bigger than just your own comfort and your own pleasure. Every day you wake up breathing is a day that something in this world is being held back, delayed, given more time, because you're still here doing what you're supposed to be doing. That's heavy. That's not a burden to make you anxious. That's an honor to make you walk a little straighter. You being alive today might be the exact reason somebody else in your family, your community, your bloodline gets an extra chance to get it right. The same way the whole earth got extra centuries of mercy simply because Methuselah kept breathing. Lesson number 2, legacy outlives argument. Methuselah's name has been debated, mistranslated, whitewashed, painted over, mythologized, and still. After thousands of years, we sitting here talking about him, tracing his lineage, digging through Hebrew and archaeology and Ethiopian scripture just to get closer to the truth of who he really was. That tells you something about legacy, family. They can try to paint over your history, but the roots stay in the ground. The roots don't disappear just because somebody planted new grass on top. Somebody, somewhere down the line, always eventually starts digging, and when they dig, the truth is still down there, waiting, patient, unmoved, exactly where it's always been. That's what Genesis 5 did for us. That's what the Ethiopian church did by preserving Enoch's book for over 1,000 years while everybody else forgot it existed. Truth is patient. Truth outlasts propaganda every single time, as long as somebody's still willing to dig. Lesson number 3, don't let somebody else's convenience determine your identity. I said this earlier, but I need you to sit with it one more time before we close out. Renaissance painters painted Bible characters white because it was convenient for their own cultural moment, not because it was accurate. Slaveholders twisted the curse of Canaan into a curse on black people because it was economically convenient, not because it was textually accurate. Colonial anthropologists erased African record-keeping sophistication because it was politically convenient, not because it was historically accurate. You see the pattern over and over again in history. Convenience beats accuracy when nobody's holding the powerful accountable to the actual text, the actual evidence, the actual paperwork. Your job, our job, is to always go back to the paperwork. Don't accept the convenient version just because it's the version that's been repeated the loudest and the longest. Loud and long don't equal true. Go check Genesis 2:13 yourself. Go check Genesis 10 yourself. Go check Genesis 9 yourself and see for yourself that the curse falls on Canaan, not Cush. Don't take my word for it either, family. That's the whole point. I'm not asking you to trade one authority figure telling you what to believe for another authority figure telling you what to believe. I'm handing you the actual verses and telling you to read them for yourself. Slow, plain, without the filter. Lesson number 4. Your ancestors were builders, record keepers, astronomers, and patriarchs of sacred history, not footnotes. I don't care what textbook you grew up with. I don't care what teacher told you Africa's history started with slavery and colonization, like there was just a blank void before European ships showed up. That is a lie, and it's a lie that this Methuselah story, properly understood, absolutely dismantles. Cush was there before Rome. Cush was there before Greece had city-states. Nubian pyramids were rising out of the sand, while most of Europe was still living in scattered tribal settlements without written language. Ethiopian Christianity was preserving sacred texts with monastic discipline, while the texts got lost and forgotten in other parts of the so-called civilized Christian world. This is not a story of a people who arrived late to history. This is a story of a people who were there at the root, who held the record, who kept the receipts literally in ink, in stone and oral tradition passed word for word through professional griots for centuries. That's your inheritance if you claim it. That's not something you got to invent or exaggerate. That's something you just got to go dig up, dust off, and hold up to the light. Lesson number 5, and this might be the most important one because it's the one that applies no matter what you believe about the specific historical debates we cover tonight. Presence matters more than perfection. Methuselah, as far as the text tells us, doesn't do anything spectacular. He doesn't part a sea. He doesn't build an ark. He doesn't defeat a giant with a slingshot. He doesn't write a book of Proverbs or compose a psalm. His entire recorded legacy, as far as the specific text goes, is that he lived, he had a son, he lived a whole lot longer, he had more sons and daughters, and he died. That's it. That's the whole recorded biography of the longest living human being in recorded history. And yet his presence, his simple continued existence, held back the flood. His presence connected Adam's generation to Noah's generation. His presence bridged the entire pre-flood world into the post-flood world simply by being alive long enough to be the link. You don't have to do something spectacular every single day to matter. Family, sometimes your presence alone, your continued faithfulness, your continued showing up, your continued breathing and trying and getting up the next morning, even when nothing spectacular is happening, is exactly what's holding something bigger together than you even realize. Methuselah teaches you that consistency and presence, even without spectacle, is sacred work. So let's bring the whole thing together now. Let's tie the ribbon on this, because I told you this wasn't going to be your uncle just talking loud with no proof, and I meant it. We established straight from Genesis 2 verse 13 that the Gihon River, one of the 4 rivers flowing out of Eden, the birthplace of humanity, is explicitly tied to the land of Cush, which the overwhelming historical, linguistic, and theological consensus, Josephus included, identifies as Ethiopia, as black African land. We established, straight from Genesis 5, the meticulous, mathematically precise genealogical record of Methuselah's 969 years, a number the text itself calculates for you, generation by generation, refusing to let itself be dismissed as vague mythology. We established that Methuselah's own name carries prophetic weight tied to the timing of the flood, that his death and the flood's arrival converge in the same year according to careful genealogical calculation. We established that his grandson Noah becomes father to Ham, whose descendants, according to Genesis 10, populate Cush, Mizraim, Put, and Canaan, the African and Near Eastern nations, meaning Methuselah sits at the literal root of the family tree that produces the African nations named with dignity in Scripture. We established that the so-called curse of Ham, used to justify centuries of slavery, is a documented misreading, since the actual curse in Genesis 9 falls specifically on Canaan, not on Cush, not on the African line at all. We established that Ethiopian Christians, black African Christians, preserve the Book of Enoch, connected directly to Methuselah's own father, in their sacred canon for over 1,000 years in the Ge'ez language, while European Christianity lost the text entirely for centuries. We established that other ancient civilizations, Sumerian king lists, Egyptian dynastic records, African oral griot traditions, independently preserved cultural memory of extraordinarily long pre-flood lifespans followed by a dramatic post-flood decline, a pattern too consistent across unconnected cultures to dismiss as isolated myth. And we established that modern science, through telomere research and epigenetic research, has at minimum opened the door to biological plausibility for extended lifespan under different environmental conditions, rather than slamming that door shut the way skeptics like to assume science automatically does. That's the paperwork, family. That's the receipts. Stack it all up, and what you got is not some fringe theory cooked up to make anybody feel good. What you got is a careful, textual, historical, geographical, and even scientific case that Methuselah, the oldest man who ever lived, the man whose life quite literally delayed the apocalypse, was rooted through unbroken lineage in Black African geography and Black African descendants, and that this truth got buried, painted over, and weaponized against the very descendants it should have honored for centuries, until people were willing to sit down, pour a drink, open the actual book, and read it slow.